Well, it literally takes just one fleeting moment and you could lose your entire livelihood or, at worst, your life. Now, sadly, we saw this was the case for many of those residents of that building in Marshalltown after that fire ripped through the CBD a few days ago. Now, the issue of buildings and shack fires has been a major concern in our country for a very long time. It's certainly nothing new. Well, senior researcher in fire engineering at Stellenbosch University, Dr. Natalia Flores Quiroz, knows a bit more about this. Thank heavens I have an expert with me. Doctor, good morning to you. Good to have you on eNCA. Appreciate the time. You look very busy. I won't keep you too long. Do you have any thoughts about that fire last week? I'm not asking what you think caused it, but just how quickly that fire spread. What's your view on what happened in that building?
Oh, well, good morning and thanks for the invitation. Well, I think it's what we often see in informal settlements where there's so much fuel load, there's too many people living there, buildings or dwellings don't comply with the codes, regulations. So it's just too many factors that come together to allow to have a big, huge fire where we usually see a lot of people dying, a lot of fatalities.
And one of your expertise, Doctor, as well, is to take a look at evacuations, isn't it? One of your expertise is taking a look at evacuations. I don't imagine, tell me if you agree, Doctor, that a hijacked building has their evacuation standards up to code. I don't imagine that's the case.
Yeah, no. From what I've been reading, there was one exit route, and a five-story building, residential occupation should have at least two. The only exit route was also blocked. I read that they have gates, that people died trying to evacuate through the exit routes, and that's why people started jumping through the windows. Also, in enclosures, we can see smoke starts to develop very quickly. So the smoke kind of avoid people to find the exit routes. It also produces physical, like people are not really in their senses, so they can. It's very difficult for them to be able to think and find the exit routes.
Yeah, it's almost it's almost a panic state, isn't it? Because I wanted to ask.
No, actually,
I wanted to ask about human behavior in a fire situation like that. People don't know how to sort of control their emotions, how to handle a fire situation. Actually, but it's so unusual for us, isn't it?
No, not really. And I think that's one of the most important things about human behavior in fire. People don't panic. Because if you think of yourself being in an emergency situation, being a fire, an earthquake, whatever, if you start crying, if you start running, if you start yelling, that's not panicking. That's a normal reaction in front of that situation. If you would freeze, for instance, if you see there's a fire and you just freeze, then you're panicking because your behavior is irrational. You're not doing what you're supposed to be safe. So when we see people trying to jump out of the window, it's not an irrational decision. I was hearing one of the survivor statements, and he said, either I die burned or I die in the fall. What is easier for my family to recognize me? So he jumped through the window because he thought, okay, at least my family is going to be able to recognize me. That's not panicking. He is thinking, he's making these decisions, and it's just the decisions that you can make in front of that situation when you have limited time and you have limited information.
It's almost rationalizing, isn't it, Doctor? I never actually thought about looking at it like that. It's almost you've got a terrible situation or a worse situation, and someone's made a decision to go for the better of the terrible situation. It's rationalizing, isn't it?
It is. And that's what we see in fires and in other type of emergencies. People don't start just running in circles or hating each other. They help each other. That's what we see. There's a lot of research that has been done in real incidents where you see people helping each other, kind of thinking and making the best decision they can with whatever they know. So that's why we also are able to modulate evacuation and to kind of estimate how people are going to behave and how long is it going to take to evacuate a building. can you imagine if people would panic? We couldn't do that, because how can we simulate those behaviors?
I want to ask, get your thoughts, Doctor, as well on this structure specifically, but now we're starting to get a better sense, other buildings in the Joburg CBD, and I'm sure there's other areas around the country. Right now, we're just focusing on the Joburg CBD, having what is an informal settlement, isn't it? It's shacks, it's informal settlements inside of these buildings. How do you begin to explain, as a fire engineer, how dangerous that is? I mean, it's only a matter of time. I hope I'm wrong, but it's only a matter of time until there's another massive fire in one of these buildings.
You know, unfortunately, you're not wrong. It's very complicated. It's a very complicated situation, because if you are living in a building like that in those conditions, it's just a matter of when, not if. It's gonna be the candle, it's gonna be the stove, it's gonna be whatever, an electric failure, and so it's very complicated. And I think, at least in informal settlements, that like not in this type of informal settlements in a building, people have more time to react. The smoke doesn't really concentrate in just one small enclosure, so maybe even though it can be terrible as well and it can affect a lot of dwellings, I don't think that we usually see so many fatalities. So I would say that these type of buildings are much more complicated than what we are often seeing in the other informal settlements.
As a fire engineer, Doctor, what do you try and get across in a situation like this? Perhaps there's those in the city of Johannesburg watching, there are those in decision-making positions that are trying to fix this hijacked building problem we have. Is there something you can offer up as a fire engineer to try and prevent this from happening? Or is it just because of the state of play? Is it because it's a hijacked building? There really isn't much we can do to stop fires starting. What would you tell, for example, Gauteng government or the Joburg mayor?
Well, as a fire engineer, we do have a lot of codes and standards in order to provide a safety building or safety conditions for the residents or occupants of a building. If we are not complying with that, it's very difficult. But I understand also that it's not as easy as bring people to formal houses, right? That's a very complicated thing, and I don't think it's going to happen soon. So, for instance, what we are doing in the other informal settlements is try to understand what happens, try to understand the living conditions. To be honest, I'm not so familiar with this type of buildings, with the other informal settlements I am. And what we see is that often the responsibility is on the residents, because they are the first ones that can react. So of course, it would be better if it's prevention, but sometimes that's very difficult. So we would say try to use safer methods for lighting, for cooking. But then if it's not that, try to be prepared, maybe receive some training in order to be able to put down a fire. But that's also very dangerous. I mean, you should only try to extinguish a fire if it's a small fire, if it's just starting. So probably this is not going to be the case. This fire started at night, so probably most people were sleeping. I don't think it would have been very easy for someone to see the fire just developing and try to put it down. But yeah, it's a very complicated situation.
It is. Doctor, thank you very, very much. Hopefully we'll talk again, perhaps more on the informal settlements fires. Now that you and I have had a chance to talk, I certainly hope we can again about the informal settlements. But I appreciate your time in talking to us about this. Dr. Natalia Flores Quiroz joining us this morning from Stellenbosch University. And fascinating, because I think a lot of people, and I probably made the error as well, thinking when that fire started in that building, there would have been panic. But fascinating, the doctor saying, no, actually not.
And listening to her say that, it reminds me, Gareth, I don't know if you've ever been in a car accident, but when you're in a car accident, everything seems to slow down. The car might be rolling, but everything happens in your own mind at such a slow pace, that slow motion. So adrenaline kicks in, something which is perhaps akin to survival instinct just kicks inside of us, and we end up thinking and doing things that perhaps under ordinary, normal circumstances we would not have done. So when she talks about being prepared as well, that just rings true.
I like what we'll take away from that, and this is why I want to follow up with the doctor as a team as well, is maybe there is something there about training or education at a school level, maybe in informal settlements, to try and prevent the fire from happening, first of all, but how to stop a small fire becoming bigger. Maybe there's something there. We'll pick up on that. That was fascinating.
And even for us, Gareth, what do you do in a situation like that?
Yeah.
We don't often have the opportunity to think of the worst case scenarios that can happen in our lives. You know, for example, when I was hijacked some months ago, I'd never really gone through that in my mind. So I wasn't really prepared for an eventuality like that. You know, but it's so important, I think, to put yourself in the worst case scenario so that should that happen to you, what do you do? Somehow be prepared on a subliminal level.
It's almost like scenario planning. Imagine the worst, prepare for it. It's a great conversation to have with the doctor. Hopefully we get her back.